ecology students, I hope you all are doing just fine. Wow, we are continuing on through our adventure in ecology for this semester, and you had your levels of species ecology, then population ecology and community ecology, and here we are talking about ecosystem ecology. Now, this is part one. There are two parts to ecosystem ecology. The first one, we just define what ecosystems are, and then go through some more common types of ecosystems. And then the second part, next week, is where you'll hit on more specifically how ecosystems function and how they work. Now, in community ecology, of course, as we were building up on our hierarchy of all living things, I should go back and say population ecology and then species ecology. You know, your species was your individual, your eastern painted turtle, and your population ecology was a grouping of that single species in any geographic area. Your community included all the living populations in that geographic area. And now with ecosystems and ecosystem ecology, by definition, ecosystems are now including the non-living components of said geographic area, and how the non-living components affect the living things there and vice versa. So we are going to, again, talk a bit about different types of ecosystems. So, right, you've got, just as with population and community, as long as you're referring to the living things and how they interact with non-living things, the geographic area is inconsequential. So you can have an ecosystem under a rock. You can have an ecosystem in your dog's ear. What's living in your dog's ear? I know with my pug, lots of yeast and bacteria live there. And you have to consider, well, why do lots of yeast and bacteria live there? It's because her floppy ears keep that area, unfortunately, a little too wet and warm, and yeast like that, and so do bacteria. So what do we do to combat that? We change the non-living conditions so the yeast, the living things, can't grow, the bacteria. So like flushing her ears out with something that would cause them to allow the ear canal to dry out and to be more acidic to prevent yeast and bacteria to grow. Anyway, I digress. So your ecosystem could be your dog's ear under a rock, or it can be the ocean as an ecosystem, or an entire continent. So needless to say, there are numerous, countless ecosystems. And we're just going to talk about the major ecosystems here. Now, there's one thing to take into consideration as far as I know how ecosystems work is going to be in our next lecture, but just a concept as far as any given geographic area that has set up some abiotic or non-living conditions, that is what allows plants, animals, and fungus, the ones that live there, to live there. Like if you have a desert, you have cacti that live there, or other desert animals that would not do well in a rainforest or in an ocean, for instance, because they have evolved to live in that specific region. And any given species that lives in an ecosystem has its range of tolerances that it can, or I should say conditions that it can tolerate while it's living in that ecosystem. Now, some of your species in an ecosystem, some of populations, have a wide range of tolerances within that ecosystem. And we see, for instance, here, like carp, those are just big goldfish, really. And as you can see here, carp that live in the water, that they can live in oxygen concentrations that are very low, or they can live in oxygen concentrations that are somewhat high. There's a wide range of oxygen and a wide range actually too of temperature that they can exist in. So they have a very wide range of tolerances, conditions under which they can live, and so they tend to fare quite well if there are any changes to the abiotic conditions of ecosystems. The generalists, or so we would say. But there's some species living in those same ecosystems which tend to have a very narrow range of tolerances, what we would say the specialists, like trout, for instance. As you can see here, trout are fish that can only live in low temperature waters with a high amount of oxygen. And so therefore, you're not able to, or if you have trout, that after, yeah. Is it even, I'm sorry, is it even open?
Till 6.
Oh, okay, well, can you get a ride with somebody else? Sorry,
Nope.
class. Oh, we'll try to get a ride with somebody else for now, and if not after. Sorry, class. Trout have a very narrow range of tolerances, and so therefore, if you do see, like for instance, in any given stream where trout normally exist, if you see that the trout die off, you know that perhaps there is maybe not a disease, but there might be some sort of a change that has occurred. Maybe the water has warmed up, or maybe for some reason your dissolved oxygen has dropped. These are commonly known as indicator species. And as an ecosystem ecologist, you would work with a species ecologist in knowing that if you see a change in the community assemblage or a drop in any given population, numbers of any given species, that it might be because you have a change in the abiotic conditions. Oh, and that is referred to as the law of limiting factors. That's very important. So we have different types of ecosystems in general. Again, there are numerous types. We're just going to go over some of the major ones, some of the ones that are more well known. What is not listed here, but as you're going to see throughout this part 1 presentation, is the major categories of ecosystems. You have terrestrial ecosystems. These are ecosystems that are dominated by land. You have aquatic ecosystems. Now, these are ecosystems that are dominated by water and not any or very little emergent vegetation. You have coastal ecosystems, and these are ecosystems where you have a terrestrial component and an aquatic component, but that aquatic component is saltwater or marine. And then you have wetland ecosystems, which by definition are those ecosystems where you have some sort of a terrestrial component in addition to a freshwater component. And we're just going to go over a few of these particular characteristics. So here are your terrestrial ecosystems, and the major drivers as far as what indicates terrestrial ecosystems are the precipitation amount over a year's time versus the temperature trends over a year's time. In a nutshell, you can see here, like for instance, where you have annual low temperatures, mean low temperatures, and low precipitation, you wind up with a tundra. And the opposite would be if you have a lot of precipitation, a lot of rain, and you have high temperatures year round, you wind up creating those conditions in that we refer to as a tropical forest or a rainforest. And you have different plants and animals that thrive in either one of these, but they can all be graphed here when you're graphing the mean temperature versus precipitation. And you see here on this particular graph that this is a general schematic as far as these terrestrial ecosystems. And these are the generalized ones, the big ones. And that's not to say like within, for instance, your temperate deciduous forest, which is where we are, that there aren't other types of ecosystems, but this is just the overall general ecosystems that span continents. And as you can see here up at the top, the word that is often used for that is the word biome. So just to generally go through a few of these. Now we're as mentioned, where you have a lot of precipitation, a lot of rain, annual rainfall, and annual, or I should say, average high temperatures year round, you wind up with a rainforest, a tropical rainforest, and you wind up, which goes to follow, many of these in equatorial regions, as you see here. And we're talking about a lot of rain, 60 to 260 inches a year. Your average temperature is 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very high in humidity. These areas are prized for their high degree of biodiversity, as you recall from community ecology, why that is important. And some people say, well, wow, you've got lots of plants, different kinds of plants and different types of animals. You must have some great soil there. And unfortunately, you don't have great soil, or not unfortunately, but ironically, you don't have great soil here in rainforest. The rainforest, it's actually um, pretty poor. And the reason for that is because it rains so much, you wind up having a lot of nutrients washed out of the soil. And what you also have, because it's so humid and because it's so hot, is you have a lot of fungal species that grow in rainforests. And fungus, the way a fungus survives is by extracting nutrients from either the ground or from something that it's living on. And so since you have such a high degree of fungus in a rainforest, it takes that out of the soil as well. So the soil tends to be really poor in nutrients. Now, what that means in in human terms, as far as rainforests are concerned, and why they're subject to a lot of habitat destruction, is because as people move into rainforests and they want to set up some sort of a crop, is they will cut down all the trees and then they will grow whatever crop they're growing. And the soil is just really poor. So you only get maybe 2 growing seasons, at tops 3 growing seasons out of the soil. And in order to continue farming, the people doing the farming just keep cutting down forests and moving on, since the soil is not able to sustain plants, crops at that point. Now, the opposite of this, as I mentioned in the first slide, as far as that graph, is where you have low annual temperatures mixed with low precipitation, and you see them at the upper tiers of continents. You have what we call a tundra. Now, some people say, oh, a tundra, that always snows up there. They get lots of snow. And actually, they don't get lots of snow. They get very little snow, 6 to 10 inches a year of precipitation. And the reason that you see them often covered in snow is because the snow that does fall tends not to melt. Or what's depicted is sometimes, if you see a tundra in a movie, they always pick, the snow-covered ones. It makes for better film. Now, because you have these harsh conditions, you tend not to have too many plants. You can't have things with deep roots like trees or shrubs, or big shrubs, I should say, because you have permafrost in the soil, and that permafrost does not allow for, you could just put them downstairs. Thank you.
Lois gave them.
Oh, hey, way to go. That's awesome. Then you don't have roots that are able to get into the soil because of permafrost. You also have animals that aren't able to burrow under the ground, and there are a lot of animals that actually do that otherwise, but not in a tundra. Because you don't have much plant life, not a whole lot of plant diversity, you tend not to have much animal diversity either. So they tend to be very low in biodiversity. So where you have a little bit of a mix here is when you have very little precipitation, but you have various, well then what? It should be in there, or in the dryer. Where you have little precipitation, but you have actually a wide fluctuation of temperatures. You have what we call, and what I'm sure you have heard of, a desert. Now, some people sometimes think, oh, desert's always hot, and it does get hot in a desert. But in many deserts, it tends to get rather cold at night. And that is because the humidity is just so low and there's so little cloud cover that you don't have that water vapor in the air to hold on to any of the heat that's generated during the day. And you don't have cloud cover to hold on to heat either. So a lot of that thermal radiation that reaches the desert floor during the day just escapes into space as the sun goes down. As you can imagine, this sets up some really, really challenging conditions for plants and animals. Adaptations to hold onto water or to acquire water are numerous, or even behaviorally, as far as, hold on, sorry. Do you have the pass?
Yeah.
Okay. And your goggles? You don't have your goggles?
No, I fell down the stairs.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, sorry if you heard that, class. That you have behavioral adaptations, like a lot of animals will be nocturnal. You know, they'll burrow during the day and then they'll only come out at night. So you also have animals that have like really cool physiological adaptations. Like they tend to have they tend to be long-legged, or they have big ears, you know, to radiate, or I should say to, word I'm looking for, to dissipate, thank you, heat more efficiently. So all kinds of really interesting adaptations as far as animals are concerned, and of course plants. Plants can either root very deeply for water, or they tend to, or tend to have very fleshy stems or leaves in order to hold on to any water that they are able to collect. Whoop. Coniferous forests, and now we're kind of getting varied here. In a coniferous forest, you have, start off here, they tend to be in the upper level here of continents. You see in regions of Canada, Northern Europe, and you see here in Russia. It tends to be cold, not as cold as the tundra, but cold/cool year round. Tends to be somewhat dry, but not as dry as a desert or a tundra. So that is where we wind up having these coniferous forests. We also refer to these as boreal forests. Boreal means north. And taiga, which is, it's more of a colloquialism because, you know, they mean the same thing, but taiga is generally a term like you might use in Europe or in Russia versus just a coniferous forest or boreal forest. And why we call this a coniferous forest is because the vegetation that tends to dominate, because it is somewhat dry and because it is cool, the plants that are there have adaptations to keep them from losing moisture. And so they have needle-like leaves, and they tend to bear cones instead of being flowering. Since you don't have the pollinators as much, the insect pollinators especially, like bees, aren't as plentiful in these regions, so it makes more sense as far as a reproductive strategy to bear cones. And as far as those needles, like these broadleaf trees that you see kind of in our area, they tend to lose a lot of water vapor through their leaves through transpiration because of their broad surface area ratio. And needle-like leaves prevent that. And you also have precipitation is often in the form of snow in the fall and the winter and even in the spring, and needle-like leaves don't hold on to the snow like broadleaves do. The soils tend to be somewhat acidic because of the needles falling off the trees. Now there are a few deciduous conifers, there aren't that many, or deciduous evergreens. It's a little bit of, that's contradicting itself. But most evergreen needle-like trees will lose their needles, but not all at once. They're constantly shedding needles, kind of like we're shedding the hair on our head, and then they're being replaced. But nonetheless, these needles tend to make the soil somewhat acidic, so they have other plants that have adapted to these acidic conditions. And here we are. This is where we are. Yeah. Hooray for us. We are getting much more moderate here with our temperatures. So moderate precipitations, cold winters, warm summers, 4 seasons. As you can see, we belong here in our temperate, broadleaf, deciduous forest. So temperate means, as I said, warm winters, cold to slash cool winters, warm summers, seasonal, broadleaf, predominated by those trees that have broad leaves and not needle-like leaves. Now, again, you'll find needle-like leaves, and you can even have specific areas in a temperate broadleaf deciduous forest that have like stands of hemlocks or stands of spruce, but generally we have broad-leafed trees. Deciduous. That's a really big word. You probably learned this in 3rd or 4th grade. That means that the leaves fall off the trees every year. Those broadleaf types of trees that lose their leaves. And why is that important? That is really great in the way that you wind up having the leaves that fall onto the ground, obviously. And what this does is it enriches the soil. The decaying leaves add lots of nutrients to the soil. And so we generally have really good soil in our area, which means that we then have a lot of variety, a lot of biodiversity in the plants that grow. And that sets up a lot of biodiversity in the animals that we have. And we don't think of that too much because we're from here. So like when we see all these chipmunks and gray squirrels and flying squirrels and red squirrels and different types of snakes and white-tailed deer, I mean, we don't think too much about it because we see them all the time. But compared to other areas of the world, we have a lot of really cool, a really high degree of biodiversity. Now, another thing that's really cool to temperate broadleaf deciduous forests, something you may not have thought about that is unique, is that, after winter time, what do you have? You have spring. No surprise there. But that there is a time during early spring in our forest before the leaves fall or before the leaves regrow back on the trees that the sunlight hits the forest floor. It's not shaded by leaves. And so during this brief period of time in the spring, with the sunlight hitting the forest floor, we have all sorts of forest wildflowers that are able to grow, able to flourish. And, you don't see that otherwise. It's, again, pretty brief. And then, the leaves grow on the trees and then block out the sun. And usually, or most of those forest wildflowers die off. But it's a real treat for us here in our temperate broadleaf deciduous forest, and just something again that we really don't think about is because we're used to it, but that is something that is very cool and very unique to our temperate broadleaf deciduous forest. So we have then terrestrial ecosystems. Then we have aquatic ecosystems, and opposite of terrestrial, these don't involve land, but they involve water. Now that water can be flowing or it can be still. The fancy schmancy college term for an ecosystem that is still is called lentic. Now these terms I'm sure are so familiar to you. Lakes and ponds, sure. These are water that is still and that is not moving. And lakes and ponds are those bodies of water, a basin of water, which can be isolated or can be spring fed or can be fed by a creek or a stream. The difference between a lake and a pond is a size thing, and it varies. There really isn't a scientific term way. It just varies as far as how you define them, but they're both still bodies of water, mostly fresh. You can have a saltwater lake, but let's not talk about that at this point. So as far as we have ponds around here, we have lakes around here. I'm speaking about Pennsylvania. A lot of ours, though, like Lake Wallenpaupack, Lake Nakamixon, these are human-made lakes, mostly by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And technically, they're referred to as impoundments and not lakes. But it just doesn't sound as nice, so we still call them lakes. They're not natural lakes, and that's okay. They still behave like natural lakes after they've been established, several years after they've been established, as far as an ecosystem is concerned. So what do we have here as far as what shapes what is living in our lake or in our pond? Well, the big deal is the sun. Well, obviously, I should say, it's aquatic. It's water. That's the medium in which all of these plants and animals live. All right, so missed over that big one. But sunlight penetration is the big deal, because what the sun does, of course, is it allows for photosynthesis, right? And photosynthesis is the way that you have plants grow, as well as other photosynthetic organisms like phytoplankton, which are not plants, they're protists floating around the water column. And so where you can have sunlight, where you can have photosynthesis, you have a base of a food chain, which then allows for other levels of food chain critters to exist. As far as other abiotic factors, you have water depth, temperature, substrate, dissolved oxygen, pH, any pollutants. So these are other abiotic factors of ponds and lakes. Now, how you then go about as far as defining the plants and the animals that live there, you see here that you have these different types of horizontal and vertical zones, and they pretty much go to follow as far as the penetration of sunlight. Now, where you have as far as vertical, how far sunlight can penetrate is referred to as the photic zone, and below that is referred to as the aphotic zone, also referred to as the profundal zone. Now, anything on the bottom, because there are plants and animals that live on the bottom, as well as underneath the bottom, like little substrate diggers, though that's referred to as the benthic zone. So if you have an animal that just scuttles around the floor of a pond or a lake, that they are benthic, considered benthic animals. Now horizontally, you have a littoral zone and a limnetic zone. Now your littoral zone is the most productive, most biodiverse, and that's because as what defines the littoral zone is how far horizontally or how far horizontally that sunlight penetrates to the photic zone, if that makes sense. Or I should say, I'm sorry, as far as sunlight reaches the bottom of the lake, or the lake or pond, the floor of the pond, or the benthic zone. I'm trying to spit this out. So where you have sunlight that reaches the bottom floor of the lake or pond is the littoral zone horizontally. Because where you have sunlight that reaches the bottom of the lake or pond here on the shoreline is where you can have rooted plants, and that's a big deal. There's lots of things like to hide in rooted plants, as far as small fish, other critters, but then they would eat these rooted plants as well. Beyond the littoral zone, sunlight doesn't reach the bottom, so you can't have rooted plants. What you can have, though, from a photosynthetic standpoint, in the limnetic zone is you can have, in the water column, you can have photosynthetic organisms, which sets up a food web or food chain all in and of itself. Another aquatic ecosystem that is still are the saltwater or the marine seas, oceans, and lakes. So these are very, very similar as far as the abiotic conditions that set up what living things can be there. Of course, it's water, that is your medium. And here it's salt water to a much higher degree than what we would refer to as a freshwater pond or lake. Because there are technically dissolved salts in freshwater ponds and lakes, but very, very, very little. Whereas your seas and your saltwater lakes and your oceans have a higher degree of um, dissolved salts. So salt concentration, in addition to just being water in general, is going to be a driver here for abiotic conditions and what living things can be there. But again, you have sunlight penetration. How deep can sunlight penetrate? And you also have temperature, and what isn't listed here, but what is also true is other types of like water chemistry, like dissolved oxygen and the pH of the water, etc. And just like a lake or a pond, you have horizontal as well as vertical zonation. And basically the same, but unfortunately, different terminology is used. I didn't make that up, or some of it is different, so don't be hating on me for this. But just like a freshwater lake or a freshwater pond, the vertical depth in which sunlight penetrates enough for photosynthesis to take place is called the photic zone. And below that is called the aphotic zone. Now, anything vertical here we're referring to as the pelagic zone. Here is a term that's the same. Anything that lives on or in the bottom is referred to as benthos, so the benthic zone. As far as your horizontal terms, these are slightly different. Your neritic zone is going to be, and this should sound familiar, this is going to be where you have sunlight that can penetrate to the ocean floor going out this way. A high degree of biodiversity in the neritic zone. This is where you can have these rooted algal species, coral reefs, etc. And then beyond that is referred to as the oceanic zone, which tends actually to be not so biodiverse. Open ocean tends not to be. You've got fish and mammals, etc. But compared to the neritic zone, it tends to be somewhat low in biodiversity. You then have flowing bodies of water, what we call lotic ecosystem, these aquatic ecosystems. These are your rivers and your streams. And here, of course, water being your main condition, but now that you have a flowing body of water, what's going to indicate the biota that exists there is going to be the velocity of the stream. Now you also have dissolved oxygen and temperature, sunlight penetration, but a very, very fast stream versus a very slow stream or river is going to have different plants, animals, algal species that are able to live there. And we have more terms, of course, as far as what different parts of a river or stream, and then what can actually live there, and you see them illustrated here. And if you've been to a stream, and hopefully for lab we will get to one, we're planning on it as of October or August 6th when this was recorded. We go every year, but we'll see, where you have a very shallow area that is fast. We refer to that as a riffle. And this is a few things. You tend to have, because the water is running fast, you don't have a lot of like mucky, muddy substrate because the water, the velocity of the water is pulling that away from the bottom of the stream. And so you tend to have like very rocky substrates here. Gravelly maybe, but sometimes the velocity is too fast for even gravel. So small rocks or large rocks. Tends to be shallow, tends to have high amount of sunlight, so you have lots of algal species that can live here. Tend to be high in oxygen, low in nutrients because the nutrients are being carried away very, very quickly. So the animals that live here have to be able to cling to things as well as like the algal species or plants. They cling on to rocks, so they live underneath rocks. They also tend to grab their prey as it flies by them, whether they have specialized appendages to kind of hold out and get little particles of food, or whether you are, for instance, a trout that is hiding behind a rock and then kind of grabs things as they go by. Now, after that, you wind up having a run. Now, a run, they tend to follow riffles, and that is that the water is deeper here. And as much as you have velocity as a factor, it tends to be much slower than a riffle, but it is still moving quite fast. So where it is very deep, and you have a high velocity, we refer to that as a run and not a riffle. For those areas of streams where the water significantly slows down, and a lot of times it tends to be as the stream goes around a corner, and you see that right here, is you would tend to have you have what is referred to as a pool. The water slows down, and in these areas, any organic debris that's been being carried down and the water was too fast for it to find a place to land, winds up landing in a pool. So the substrate tends to be very muddy or mucky. In these pools, the water is deeper, the water is slower, so it tends to be much warmer. You tend to have lower oxygen, dissolved oxygen. And so you have those particular animals that don't need as much oxygen or don't like being in fast waters. They do have a high, or the high amount of nutrients also brings forth those that eat like little bits of nutrients, little bits of debris, like mollusks, clams and snails, worms, and turtles. Estuaries are specialized aquatic ecosystems where rivers meet oceans or seas. And these are very specialized ecosystems and very unique in that the plants and the animals that live there have to undergo many changes throughout a 24-hour period because they're subject to tidal actions. I mean, like for instance, this is that is colored here in blue. This is an estuary. And during a high tide, and it depends on where you are on the planet. Sometimes you have one high tide and low tide a day. Sometimes you have multiple a day. Depending on how high the high is, how low the low is. Depends on where you are on the planet. But during a high tide, all of the seawater, yeah, right. Okay, I'm getting them mixed up. Where you have a high tide, you have seawater, salt water that goes up into the river. And during a low tide, you have the fresh water then go out of the river and extend into the ocean. So the plants and the animals that live here are subjected to different salinity levels, different nutrient levels, different levels of depth of water, and even dry at some point, dried up, especially along the edges here at some point. Sometimes, either once or twice a day, or sometimes 4 times a day. So you do have very specialized animals and plants that are able to, and usually only live in estuaries. Coastal ecosystems, these are those areas where you have the ocean or some salt water that mixes with some sort of a terrestrial component. And some of us have been to the beach. So this is one I think that is most familiar with people are beaches. Now you have 2 different types of beaches or shores. You have those that are predominated by sand. Now those are the ones that we have here as far as a substrate is concerned, sand or some type of mud. You go to the Jersey Shore, you go to a beach in Delaware or Maryland or Virginia, or even almost all the way down the East Coast, and you have a sandy beach. If you start to go further north, or if you go to the northwestern part of the United States, instead of having sand or mud, you have rock that is the predominant substrate. And there's a lot of difference here between rocky shores and sandy shores as far as those abiotic conditions and what plants and animals can live there and other and algal species. Now, there are similarities. Like, for instance, you are in both of these um, shore coastal ecosystems, you're subjected to waves and you're also subjected to tidal differences. So sometimes you're submerged and sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're getting beaten by waves and then sometimes you are not. Now, the differences here is that in a sandy shore, you're not really able to hold on to anything. If you've ever held on to sand as an animal or a plant or an algal species, you can't root into sand and stay there. So you wind up having some animals that kind of burrow underneath the sand that live right in this area where the ocean meets the land. I know in New Jersey area you have like little sand crabs. Further down south you have coquinas or little like clam shells that you see, and then you see the birds that are the shore birds that are kind of walking along that area and kind of poking their beaks in and eating them. Whereas like a rocky shore, because rock is your substrate, plants and animals have the ability to hold on to a rock. They have holdfasts, for instance, on a lot of the algal species, like kelps, etc., that they can stay there. Different species of barnacles and oysters and mussels live on these rocky shores because they can hold on to that, and they can be underwater or above water for certain periods of time, or get sea spray, for instance, from a wave, um, or live in like a little tide pool, a puddle that's left behind in the rocks during certain times of the day. So you wind up having on these rocky shores a huge amount of biodiversity compared to your typical sandy shore. So you are subject here, again, when we talk about a shore ecosystem, a coastal ecosystem we call a shore, you're right at that interface where you're subjected to wave action. But where you move in a bit or you're in a different area, you're still subjected to tide variations, but you're not getting hit by wave after wave after wave. Is a coastal ecosystem that we refer to as either a salt marsh or a tidal marsh or a mangrove. It depends where you are as far as what you call these, and they are distinctively different. It's not just, you call it a creek and I call it a crick. It's not that type of difference in terminology. It depends where you are geographically. Where you have these areas that are protected from wave action that are in temperate latitudes, like in our area, like New Jersey and Delaware and further north, Virginia. Um, I don't know about North Carolina. I'm trying to think. Maryland. You have these areas predominated by grasses. And these are your salt marshes, your tidal marshes. These are differentiated by, if you go further south in tropical regions around the world, instead of grasses that predominate these areas where you don't have wave action, but you still have tidal action, you wind up with a species of trees and shrubs called mangroves. And there are many different species of mangroves, but they're much bigger. They're not grasses, they're considered trees or shrubs. Now, the similarities here is, once again, you don't have wave action, but you do have tidal variations. And you wind up having, because of that, both of these substrates wind up being somewhat muddy, sandy muddy, and you have a lot of nutrients that accumulate And you also have a very little oxygen in the substrate, in that mud, in that sand. And so you have different types of characteristics then that beget that particular condition. Now, both of these are quite biodiverse, and both of them are extremely important ecologically, and both of these have been historically seen as junk by humans because you can't build on them, and because they lack oxygen, they tend to leave off some sulfur compounds, which makes them kind of, ooh, they're smelly, kind of a thing, a rotten egg smell. And so they've been historically filled in and built on. And we have seen that that's a huge mistake because ecologically, what these do is they protect inland areas from flooding. And those that have destroyed their marshes and their mangroves, um, when it floods inland, they realize, oh shoot, maybe we should restore our marshes and mangroves. And as we'll see later on in the course, that this is a big effort in conservation, is to restore these marshes and mangroves. Uh, Extremely biodiverse, lots of plants that live here, lots of animals live here. Some permanently live in these areas, others are here. It's like a nursery for open ocean fish, and they get to an age and then they swim out to open sea. Mangroves are really cool in the way that this root system, because they're like pretty sizable trees, some of these, is that the root system under the water forms like this lattice work, like these little caves, etc., that allow open ocean fish to hide in. It's very protective for them. These roots, which is really kind of interesting, roots underground in any type of plant, including terrestrial plants, need oxygen. Like some oxygen pockets or dissolved oxygen to grow. And because this soil is so anoxic, lacks oxygen, the roots themselves actually come out of the water, which form that like lattice work underneath for all the fish to hide. It's really neat. They even have like little nematophores, which is allows for gas exchange out of the water. So that is pretty cool. Whoop, come on, you can do it, please. Hey, there we go. Now, wetland ecosystems, this technically is where you have fresh water and where it meets land. Now, unfortunately, just like the mangroves and just like the salt marshes, they have been seen historically by humans as worthless or useless and have been filled in and developed and harvested. And what these do is these wetlands are extremely important. I mean, they have a high degree of biodiversity, of course, in and of themselves, but they also serve as filters for water, or where they prevent flooding, I should say, but they serve as filters for fresh water as it runs vertically from surface waters down into the water table. It cleans the pollutants out. And go back to the next slide. But also, as you have water that runs horizontally over a wetland area into then ultimately its waterway, here, there you go, it also cleans the pollutants out. So you can see the saturated water or should going into the groundwater, but also it purifies water as it goes through the streams. And so they're extremely important, and we protect our wetlands now. Now, marshes and swamps are two very common wetlands. A big difference in the two. Again, it's not just, the terminology cannot be exchanged. They're both wetlands. That is correct. However, if you have a wetland where you have, again, a wetland being freshwater with a terrestrial component, where you have it predominated by grasses. So you have water here and you have grasses. Reeds, sedges, and cattails is where we would say you have a marsh. Where you have water and the terrestrial component has trees and shrubs, that's what we call a swamp. So there is a difference between a marsh and a swamp. Marsh is a wetland that has grasses. Swamps are wetlands that have trees and shrubs. These wetlands that where the surface is close to, or the water table is very close to the surface, you have different types of the terminology is depending on where you are in the world. Mires, bogs, moors, fens. This is where you have a very squishy, soft area. We have some bogs in this region actually. They're ancient lakes that have since filled in with peat, it's called. And unfortunately, we're not able to go there this semester. You also have a type of wetland, is these terrestrial areas that run horizontally around waterways, adjoin waterways. And these are during floods. It is what, August 6th, August 4th, we had a huge Isaias, I think that's how it's pronounced, that tropical storm slash hurricane that just completely flooded the Bushkill. This riparian zone is sometimes flooded during flood stages. Um, Usually it's dry, but tends to keep that stream healthy. And because what it does is it, again, as water runs horizontally over the ground during a heavy rain or just during a rainstorm into a stream, it cleans the pollutants out and is better for the water quality. Riparian zone is extremely important, and we've just recognized this in the last 20 or 30 years. Whereas our public parks, Monocacy is the one. I actually hadn't been there in about 20 years, and I was just there this summer. Monocacy and most parks used to mow and maintain their grasses, their lawns, all the way up to the edge of the stream because that looked so nice. It was aesthetically pleasing. You could walk into the stream, you could picnic next to the stream. And what they noticed was, or what we as ecologists realized, is that the water quality is just so much better when you let the vegetation grow anywhere like optimally 100 yards from that particular stream area. But from an aesthetic standpoint, recreational standpoint, that looks terrible, right? Because you can't even see the stream. You can't walk up to it. It's just full of weeds and ticks and blah, blah, blah. And there has been, and I say Monocacy because when I visited 20 years ago, it was maintained fastidiously as far as mowing up to the side of the stream. And now 20 years later, I go to visit, and they do have now a riparian zone, a buffer zone, that they're letting the vegetation grow. The compromise is that there are areas that are mowed and maintained in these public areas where you can access the stream. So all right, they did some good, but they have to kind of meet halfway with the needs or wants of the public. So they did that too. And back when I was most of you are 18, 19, 20, way back, some of you have heard this story before, when I was your age and we were trying to get the Allentown Park System to create a riparian buffer zone around their park in the Parkway system. It's one of the biggest in Pennsylvania. We would talk about water quality when we went to these zoning meetings and board meetings or the Parks and Recreation. Talk about water quality, and it's better for nature, it's better for this, and usually it fell on deaf ears, to the board. They were like, yeah, whatever. Oh, there are those weirdos again, those eco hippies, blah, blah, blah. And then finally we did a cost benefit analysis. If they stopped mowing around the stream, as far as how much money they would save the taxpayers of the Allentown area because they wouldn't use as much gasoline for their mowers, they wouldn't use as much employee time to mow those areas, and then they could actually claim that they were being eco-friendly, and they could advertise they were being eco-friendly to attract a whole different dynamic to the parks. And that's when they were like, oh, we could save money. Oh, that's great. And that's when they actually listened to us. If some of you are choosing to go down the road of being implementing or affecting policy, sometimes you just have to know the language of the people with whom you are speaking. And then as far as wetlands are concerned, we have this phenomenon of how do you identify a wetland? Well, the soils and the water, of course, but the plants are those that will tell you whether or not you have a wetland. For those of you who, I know some of you want to be ecologists, and this is where it's at as far as, at least, for the past few years, is being a wetland ecologist. How would you identify them? Well, plants is a great way of identifying if you have a particular wetland. And you have these particular plants, which, if they are present, it means you absolutely have a wetland. We refer to those as obligate wetland plants. So if you have cattails and bulrushes, bald cypress, you say, yes, this is a wetland by default because these plants are present. Now, you do have those plants that just like to have their feet wet. They may or may not be found in wetlands, and that's what we call facultative. Your alders, your red maples. You can have red maples growing outside of a wetland, but they are often located there. It doesn't definitively tell you you have a wetland, but if you see a red maple or a few of them, you might say, I wonder if this is a wetland. Let's look for let's look for the obligate ones. So that was these are the types of wetlands. I'm sorry. These are the types of ecosystems that we have as far as general categories of your types of ecosystems in your general categories. Your terrestrial, aquatic, coastal, and wetland. So anyway, a bit of a longer lecture. Sorry about that. Very sorry for the interruptions with my son. So anyway, that's it. And take care. If you have any questions, just ask in the discussions. Thanks, guys. Bye.